Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here. Today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about people who have to actually function in the real world versus hypothetical optimal situations with your training. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on skilling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. Because, this is a lot of stuff that we talk about, and there's a lot of research and data and everything else out there to basically try to help people find what they need to do with their training to maximize their gains, maximize their performance. In other words, gain as much muscle, as much strength, things like that as you can possibly do in terms of total training load, training volume. And that's one of the things that has always puzzled me is that this stuff gets brought up a lot. People have been debating a lot of this lately. There have been a lot of studies on it and experts, and they keep pushing in the direction of these ultra high volumes because when we look at the data, athletes tend to get better results when training volume becomes very, very high. But the problem that we run into with this is that these are hypothetical optimal situations, right? These are optimal situations, and they're working under the assumption that a person is in good health all the time, meaning in perfect health, no real issues, probably minimally stressed lifestyle, a lot of other factors going on there, ideal diet, when in reality the vast majority of people out here who are training are not professional athletes. They're probably not even high-ranking competitive athletes. In fact, the majority of people who are trying to use a lot of this training stuff have full-time jobs, they have lives, they have families, and they oftentimes have other goals besides maximum size and strength through the entire year. In other words, a lot of this stuff, when we look at these situations, they assume a perfect growth scenario. In other words, when we look at a lot of these really high volumes of training, what is it that people need to understand? These are assuming we're in a perfect environment. Well, here's the first question I would ask a lot of people out there. How many of you are in a calorie surplus 52 weeks a year? In other words, part of the perfect environment for performance and gaining muscle, gaining strength, any of these things, because they're all correlated, involves at least some small caloric surplus during the entire period of time in which you're training ideally, because otherwise you really think you're going to maximize muscle growth without enough total calories to actually gain muscle? Of course not. So when we start thinking of these things, we need to understand that this is actually assuming you're at least clean bulking, slow bulking. It's the same thing. That's what the assumption being made is when we start looking at what are optimal training volumes. And that was one of the things that came up because some people had gone to Dr. Mike Israetel, I think, in one of his Q&As, who I'm actually friends with him. And they had said, hey, here's what Jason Blaha is doing with his current routine. And he had said, oh, yeah, he would gain more muscle if he did more volume. But see, they neglected to say, oh, he's dropping 2 pounds of body weight every week. Do you guys see the difference? Had they told him, hey, this is what he's doing to try to hold on to muscle during a pretty fast weight loss phase as a strength athlete, he's dropping, multiple weight classes while doing this. If we were to look at it from that perspective, had people said that, they would have gotten a different answer. He would have been like, oh, it's probably okay for what he's doing. And people need to understand that difference. So when we start talking about maximizing training volume, this is assuming that you're maximizing everything. In other words, some of these people are like, oh yeah, I'm doing 20 sets per muscle group or 30 sets per muscle group for hypertrophy purposes, but they're not gaining weight. They're not in a bulk. That's really kind of stupid because it's not going to work. It's not like you're going to maximize your growth potential purely through the training end if you're not providing the fuel necessary to fuel the training, to fuel the recovery, to fuel the growth. These things matter, and they matter tremendously, and you can't escape that. So that's one of the things that we need to think about immediately. How many people out here are literally planning on gaining weight year-round? Well, if you aren't, then your training is going to change. Your maximized volume for an ideal amount of growth and training response assumes that your lifestyle is perfect for maximizing growth and training response. So in other words, you don't ever plan on cutting. You don't ever plan on maintaining. Because when you do, those training loads are going to have to come down because you're not going to have the recovery, the training fuel, everything else. And here's what we need to remember when it comes to this stuff. When we're talking about these very, very high training workload systems or phases, What people need to understand, it's not a linear response. In other words, if you double your training volume, you don't double the amount of muscle that you gain. Oftentimes, there's a extreme diminished return happening here. So a lot of times, if you go from doing, I don't know, your 10 really hard quality sets for a given muscle, like let's say quads with the squats, right? So you're doing 10 sets of squats every week, and you go to 20 sets of squats every week, you're not going to double the muscle gain. What you might be looking at is a 1% or a 2% improvement in muscle growth during that phase, maybe a 5%. We're talking about a very, very small, disproportionate amount of additional growth for the amount of work you're doing. Well, when we start working that into people who have to function in the real world, who are not serious competitors, anyone see the problem here? You could be destroying your recovery, affecting your quality of life, really struggling to balance that fine line between maximum recoverable volume and food intake, rest, sleep, everything else. But you're doing it just trying to glean that little tiny extra advantage. And had you stayed at a slightly lower threshold, had you stuck with 10 sets of squats a week instead of 20, and just using that as an example, you wouldn't have the same issues, and it would give you a lot more flexibility with these things. Because here's what we have to account for people in the real world. Most people have jobs, families, other stuff going on that's going to interfere. This is not your full-time gig. It's not the only thing you have going. And if it is, and you're not making your living at it, the first thing I would say to a lot of these people is maybe you need to get a life. And I'm just calling it like it is. If you are not making money as a result of your training in some way, and you're literally dedicating your life to it, and maybe I'm burning some of my own audience, because a lot of people who watch YouTube Fitness, that might be why they watch YouTube Fitness, looking for those secrets. Well, the thing that I would ask them is this really going to make you happy? In other words, is devoting your entire life to gaining an extra pound of muscle for purely vanity purposes? You're not going to make a living out of it. It's not your career. You're not a professional in any way. Is that really going to be worth it to you? Because that's something that we need to look at with all of this. People spend all this time worrying about maximizing this stuff, but it's like, do you compete in something? Are you a serious competitor in something, or are you just someone who plays around and maybe messes with a little bit of, powerlifting? You do one powerlifting meet a year, right? You do one powerlifting meet a year. You go do one bodybuilding show a year, right? You're not that serious about it. In other words, it's just a fun little side hobby. Your whole life doesn't revolve around it. But, a lot of times people will try to maximize all this stuff without thinking at it from that perspective. And it's like, if you're a recreational, meaning, in other words, if that's your idea of competing in something, you do one competitive event a year, you're not that serious of a competitor to the point to where you need to be spending all your time worried about maximizing training response. For most people, they're not going to see a massive difference. You're only going to see that difference come out in a competitive environment. And I think that's why guys like Burkham and Kinobody and a lot of these other people who really promote a fair amount of minimalist training, that's why their people are happy with their results, because they do have them get in and do just enough training to really get some muscle growth going, get the muscle growth in the right areas or overall growth, and then they get out of the gym and then they're recovered. They're not beat up all the time because they're not pushing that bleeding edge of maximum recoverable volume. Because we do have to be aware of that. We have to think of those things of are you pushing that bleeding edge, particularly for your lifestyle? Because variables in your lifestyle are going to affect that. You could go through a more stressful time at work. Your work could pick up. Some stuff in your family life could pick up. Maybe something changes in your dating life or romantic life that starts affecting your recovery, your time, everything else. Well, when these things in the real world start impacting you, it will affect this stuff, and you can't stand around as someone who's not an extremely serious competitor, or your career or money is depending on this in some way. Trying to ride that bleeding edge all the time is really quite silly. It's really a misallocation of resources, because you literally sometimes you're riding that bleeding edge hoping for a 1% advantage, right? That's what you're hoping for. And now if you're a serious competitor and your life revolves around this at a serious level, that 1% could make or break you. But for the average recreational lifter who just says, oh, I just want to look good and be able to deadlift 500 pounds, All right, that's not a serious goal. That doesn't require that level of dedication to where you have to glean that last 1%, right? It's not necessary for those goals. So it's just food for thought for people. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.